financial services. We have invited the spokesperson of PBOC and the Director General of the Statistics and Analysis Department, Madam Ruan Jianhong, Mr. Sun Guofeng, and Mr. Zhou Lan from the Financial Market Department. They will report to you and take your questions. Now, firstly, Lady Ram. Dear media friends, good afternoon. Since 2021, PBOC has strictly executed the policies of the CPC Central Committee with the prudent monetary policy, with flexibility and steadiness. We will guarantee the sufficient supply of money by improving the financial institutions' capital structure. We will give full play to refinancing and other structural monetary instruments. We will continue to release the dividends of LPR reform to guarantee that the supply of money is consistent with the nominal growth ratio of the economy and to keep the steadiness of the macro leverage ratio. For key pillars of the real economy and the weaknesses in the economy, we will step up our support. Now, I will introduce 5 points for more details. Firstly, the overall scope of finance has steadily increased with enough liquidity. In 2021, the financial sector has consolidated the achievements made in economic and social development as well as epidemic control. We serve the real economy. The overall scope of finance has steadily increased. In first half of 2021, we have increased 12.76 trillion RMB yuan of loans with 23 billion RMB yuan of balance, and that's about 0.3% higher than the previous month. Social financing increased by 11% year-on-year, leveling with the previous month. M2 growth ratio is basically in parallel with the nominal GDP growth ratio. Second, to stabilize the macro leverage ratio with stark achievements. In the first half of 2021, the national economy has generally maintained our recovery. Production and life cycles have been basically rebounding, and in quarter one, our macro leverage ratio was 276%, 2.6% lower than the previous quarter. And we also have seen the decrease of leverage ratio of 0.4 percentage points in the housing sector. Since quarter two, with the economic recovery and the debt increase, we forecast that in Q2, the leverage ratio in macro terms will be stabilized. Third, the real economy's overall financing cost has been lowered down. In 2021, PBOC continued to improve the market-based interest rate formation mechanism, improving the PBOC's policy interest rate system, and releasing the dividends of reform in interest rates. We continue to lower down the actual interest rate. We also make full use of two monetary tools to reduce the financing burden on SMEs. In the first half of 2021, the newly released credit for the SMEs with an interest rate of 5.18% compared to the previous 2 years, that's 0.3% and 1.06 percentage points lower. As to manufacturing sector, the interest ratio is about 4.13%. That's 0.25 percentage points lower than the previous year. Meanwhile, we have decreased the burden on the financial sectors by 13 billion RMB yuan. With the financial institutions' role, we can also trigger the lowering of the overall financing cost of the society. Fourth, the support of financial sector in high-quality growth. Financial sector has implemented the principles of green, open, sharing development principles, the 5-in-1 strategy, to establish a new development landscape and support high-quality growth of the economy. We also stepped up our support of scientific innovation. By the end of May, the monetary credit rate was 41.8%, with the credit balance increasing by 8 percentage points, and we also developed green finance by improving the system of green finance, establishing the information disclosure mechanism, and incentivizing the financial sector to offer more credit to the green sectors. We also insist on developing inclusive financing. By the end of June, the balance of credit for SMEs in inclusive financing increased by 31% year-on-year, and that growth ratio was 18.7% higher than the other sectors' credit. By the end of June, inclusive financing credit supported over 30 million SMEs, a year-on-year increase of 29.2%. Fifth, for key prioritized sectors, the financial risks have been successfully averted. In Q1, the shadow banking, the securities have actually decreased by 1/5 respectively, and we are exploring to have a risk handling model for SMEs. For the highly risky financial institutions, their handling has made some headways. We also improved the mechanism of the real estate. We have stabilized the prices of the real estate market and introduced a long-term mechanism for the real estate market. In general, the financial sector operation has been steady and the financial structure has been continuously improved. In the future, PBOC will continue to execute the policies of the 5th plenary session of the 18th CPC Central Committee. We will continue to pursue progress among stability. The prudent monetary policy will be carried on in a sustainable manner. We will continue to deepen our supply-side structural reform and step up our support of the private sector, the village rejuvenation, green development, and low-carbon development, and other prioritized sectors. We will continue to intensify the inclusiveness of financial sector and realizing the second centenary goal. Thank you, Madam Ruan. Next, we open the floor to our media friends. Please identify yourself before raising the questions. From China Securities, my question is, what are the structural features of the financing increase, and what will be your forecast of financing in the second half of 2021? I'm happy to take your questions. Speaking of the financing size, in the first half, the overall increment was 14 trillion. That's 3.13 trillion yuan decrease compared to the previous year. By the end of June, the social financing balance increased by 11%, almost leveling with the previous month. Such a growth ratio is consistent with the nominal GDP growth ratio. In general, the financial support of real economy is also commensurate with the economic growth. Now let's look at the structure of social financing. And based on our statistics, it is obvious that the social financing is quite fragmented, and that may have some influence over the overall size. For example, shadow banking makes the decrease of off-balance financing in half one of 2021, the three types of off-balance financing decreased by 80 million RMB yuan. Second, last year, to offset the hit of the epidemic, the government's securities and corporate bonds had big issuance, but in 2021, we have returned to normal. So we have to compare 2021 with a very high fundamental in 2020. So we have seen some increase in stock rights, and we have seen over 600 billion RMB yuan increase. For non-financial sector stock rights financing, it increased by 400 billion RMB yuan. That's 240 billion RMB yuan more than the previous year. In the second half, the prudent monetary policy will reasonably support the real economy. We forecast social financing to have a steady increase, and the growth ratio will also be in line with the nominal GDP growth ratio. Next question. From the cover, we've noticed that according to the financial report of 2021, RMB loans increased by 600 billion RMB yuan year on year, and for entities it increased as well. So what's your take on the change of credit in the enterprises? And for the next step, what will be your plan of supporting the real economy? In the first half of 2021, RMB loans increased by 12 trillion RMB yuan, 600 billion more than the previous year. By the end of June, the RMB credit increased by 12%, 0.1 percentage point higher than the previous year, but 0.9 percentage lower than the previous year. So last year we had a very high starting point. So this year, our credit extension will continue to serve the real economy and pursue the high-quality growth. You have mentioned about the credit in the enterprises. It increased by 8.37 trillion RMB yuan, a decrease of 400 billion RMB yuan. In the short term, it increased by 1.23 trillion, a decrease as well compared to the previous year. This shows us that the enterprises are returning to normal in terms of the need of cash, and the mid and long-term credit increased by 1.77 trillion RMB yuan. It also shows that financial institutions pay more attention to the mid and long-term investment in those enterprises. And as to the sectors in manufacturing, service sector, except the real estate market, the financial sector is more supportive, and the credit extension directions are continued to be improved. For manufacturing sector, mid and long-term credit increased very fast. By the end of June, the balance of credit in the sector increased by 17%, 16.9% higher than the previous year. The growth ratio has, for 4 consecutive months, increased by over 40%. For high technology manufacturing sector, mid and long-term credit increased by 46.3%. That's a very high growth ratio. For infrastructure mid and long-term credit, it also grew very swiftly. For infrastructure sector, the mid and long-term credit increased by 17.3%. 5.4 percentage points higher than the previous year. In the first half of 2021, for the mid and long-term credit in infrastructure sector, the newly added credit increased by over 900 billion RMB yuan year on year. For the service sector, our financial support is also stepping up. So the mid and long-term credit in service sector increased by 19.1% year on year, and that growth ratio is 2.3 percentage higher than the other sectors. Next question. From the Economic Daily, the SMEs play a pivotal role in employment creation and economic growth, and the financial support of SMEs have gone somewhere. So will there be any innovative measures to support the SMEs? Mr. Zhou, thank you for your questions. This year, PBOC strictly implemented the 6 stabilization policies. We value the long term and the short term in order to better support the real economy. And I would love to offer you some observations. First, the SME's financing increased, and it has been expanded to cover more sectors. By the end of June, the balance of credit for SMEs was 17.7 trillion, a year-on-year increase of 31%, supporting over 38 million enterprises. For the enterprises with a valuation of over 10 million, their balance of credit was 4 trillion RMB yuan. Second, the 2 monetary tools have led to some outcomes. By the end of May, the financial sectors have supported the SMEs by extending and renewing the loans. And for the key sectors, we have stepped up our support. By the end of May, nationwide, we have supported a total pool of enterprises with 7 trillion RMB yuan of credit support for those 380,000 enterprises. As to reducing the interest rate, we have continued to release the dividend of LPR reform. We have introduced the deposit support, account support, RMB settlement, the scanning of your credit card. In total, we have introduced 12 measures. We have also reduced the fees and charges for the ATM withdrawal, and that reduced about 24 billion RMB saving. In the first half of this year, the average interest rate was 4.41, 0.28 percentage points lower than the previous year. So financing is more convenient, and the overall financing cost is lower down. In the next step, we will continue to stabilize our monetary policies, and we will build the capacity of supporting the SMEs. We will support those small and individual businesses with our financial services. Next question. From CMG. By the end of last year, the prudent monetary policy was said to be continued. For the second half of this year, what will be the monetary policy like, and what will be the difference from the first half of 2021? Mr. Sun? Since 2021, we have continued the prudent monetary policy, highlighting stability and flexibility, stepping up our support of the real economy. Social financing increased in size, and M2 increased by 8.6% year-on-year. Social financing size increased by 11% year-on-year. In the first half of 2021, the newly added RMB credit was 12.76 trillion, a year-on-year increase of 6 trillion RMB yuan, better supporting the real economy. And second, precision support of the SMEs and manufacturing sectors. In order to fill in the loophole, by the end of May, the balance of SME's credit increased by 31% year-on-year. And by the end of May, the inclusive financing supported 30 million SMEs, a year-on-year increase of 29.9%. And as to the manufacturing sector, mid and long-term loans increased by 42.2% for 3 consecutive months. It's maintained at over 40% consecutively. And we also have lowered down the overall financing cost. The interest rate was 4.63 for enterprises. And as to the newly released SMEs credit, the interest rate with weights considered decreased by 0.15 percentage points compared to the previous year. Now, our economy is picking up, and the commodity price is steady. Last year, during our fight against the epidemic, we continued our prudent monetary policy. And since May 2020, it has already become a new normal, and in the first half of 2021, we have returned to the pre-epidemic situation. In the next step, PBOC will continue to stabilize our monetary policy, and considering the domestic and international prices of commodities, we will continue to control the support of financing sector in order to create a favorable monetary environment. For example, monetary supply in general must be kept in line with the nominal GDP growth, and structurally we will support SMEs, green development, innovation, and as to prices, we will continue to consolidate the results made in interest rate in order to reduce the burden and the cost of financing. Next question. Since the fall last year, PBOC has extended the scope of pilot projects. Last week, the governor said that you have already acquired 10 million users. So what's your comment on this pilot program? I would love to take that question. By the end of 2019, the digital RMB pilot project was tested in Shenzhen, Suzhou, Xiong'an, Chengdu, as well as the Beijing 2022 venues. In October 2020, we added Shanghai, Hainan, Changsha, Xi'an, Qingdao, Dalian into the pilot pool. The digital RMB R&D pilot places were chosen in consideration of the national development strategies, regional coordinated development strategy, as well as the local economic conditions and industrial development situations. Now, the pilot cities mainly cover the Yangtze River Delta area, Pearl River Delta area, Central China, Western China, Northeastern China, and Northwestern China. So those cities are quite representative, and that's conducive to evaluating the role of digital RMB in different places. And the testing of the pilot projects must be carried out in a safe manner, and we have a white listing, and those transactions are usually in small sizes. Different parties have shown their strong interest in digital RMB. In the pilot places, the users are quite enthusiastic about it. The scenarios cover payment, catering businesses, transportation, shopping, e-governance, and so on. Based on the results of the initial pilot programs, the testing scope of digital RMB has been steadily expanded with more interesting scenarios, and the application model have been innovated, so the pilot project is going on quite well. Next question. From China Daily. My question is, could you please introduce the results of precision poverty alleviation through the financial sector, and how can we have a smooth transition and connection between village rejuvenation and poverty alleviation? Thank you for your questions. In recent years, PBOC has been implementing the CPC Central Committee's policy. We have improved our organizational structure, and we mobilize different players to support the poor areas. We have extended 71 billion RMB yuan for the poverty alleviation, and the targeted poverty alleviation financial sector has greatly supported the success of poverty reduction campaign. In 2021, PBOC has continued to unveil a series of policies to consolidate the results of the poverty alleviation program and in order to have a smooth transition to village rejuvenation. We have a good top-level design. In June, we have promulgated a document on fully promoting village rejuvenation. We have improved our financial services to that undertaking. For example, the evaluation method. We highlight the role of performance evaluation, and we encourage more financial actors to devote themselves into the agriculture sector. The balance of credit in agriculture sector increased by over 10%. Second, the monetary tools will play a guiding role. PBOC notify different banks to continue to refinance the programs related to poverty alleviation, and those projects can enjoy an extension of the credit. We will also scale up our credit support of village rejuvenation. Third, for the key areas, we will step up our support. We will guide the financial institutions to offer financial services for the agricultural actors in order to have integrated development of the three industries. And in the next step, we will make solid steps to materialize those measures in order to help the prioritized areas to realize village rejuvenation. The new agriculture players will enjoy better financial support. For example, in the fields of seeds development and food security, we will try to avert risks, and we will try to establish a long-term supporting mechanism of the agriculture and village sectors. Next question. From the Phoenix. The PPI in June growth ratio was reduced to 8.8%. So what's your take on the trend of PPI? And do you think that jumping down will point out the future direction? And will there be any necessity of continuing to decrease the interest rate or the reserve deposit ratio? PPI increased very swiftly in the recent months. That's because we have been hit by the epidemic last year, and the international price also had an influence over us. So for the PPI increase, we must take a historical view towards it. For one thing, last year we had a low threshold. So we could compare 3 years in a row in order to have a holistic view towards PPI trend. Second, historically, PPI indicator fluctuates a lot. There has been some stage-by-stage lowering or high rocketing. That's commonplace. In general, the high rocketing of PPI is only a short-term thing, and it may remain at this relatively high level for some time because we believe that the external influence will be weakened, and by next year, it will start to slow down. As to the possibility of the deposit reserve ratio decrease, it's just a regular practice of PBOC. We aim to maintain our prudent monetary policy, and that's going to remain unchanged. Next question. Thank you. From South China Morning Post. We have seen the tightening of the financial sector with the signals like the reduction of deposit reserve ratio. Do you think there will be any risks of capital outflow? And what will be your countermeasures for such possibilities? Mr. Sun? Since 2020, China has always committed to prudent monetary policy. We executed normal monetary policies, supporting the real economy, and based on the epidemic control situation, we have controlled our pace in financial policies. Last year, because of the hit of the epidemic in real economy, the monetary policies were burdened since May last year. We have basically returned to normal in monetary policies in 2021. We have already recovered, and we are leading the way globally in terms of the extremity of the monetary policies. So against the backdrop of epidemic transmission globally, between different economies, their financial policies will be influencing each other. But considering the different epidemic control situations, the U.S. monetary policy and the Chinese monetary policy may be different. That's more than normal. Now, China's real economy is picking up and the prudent monetary policy remains unchanged. This time, we reduced the deposit reserve ratio that's aiming at improving the capital structure and better supporting the real economy. In the future, the monetary policy will continue to be stabilized. We will continue to have independent monetary policy immune from external influence, and we will consider domestic price changes and economic situation. We will also try to strike a balance between internal and external factors. And in the meantime, we will pay close attention to international financial fluctuations. So we will mainly look inward in our macro policy changes, and we will give out positive energy, trying to contribute to the global economic recovery. Next question. From CNBC, 2 questions. First, about consumption credit. Could you give us more details about the statistics of consumption credit, in particular, the revenues of different consumers? Second, about the non-performing loans and assets. The recent reports showed in different places some banks are having great gaps in terms of their NPL. So do you have any introduction about the different sorts of financial institutions and what will be the risks accordingly? So I see you have basically 2 questions. First of all, I would love to answer your second question about non-performing assets. The regulator will have more statistics. I recommend you to pay attention to the statistics if released. And as to the first question, consumption credit, maybe Mr. Zhou will be at a better place to answer it. Recently, the consumption credit has a steady increase in China that's also commensurate with the income increase of consumers. The balance of consumption credit by the end of June increased by 13% year-on-year. The short-term consumption credit increased by 11.1%. Mid- and long-term credit increased by 13.4% in the consumption sector. With the economic growth and people's livelihood improvement, the consumer's consumption still has a large room of improvement. PBOC will continue to guide commercial banks to prudently and regularly conduct such credit extension in consumption sector, better managing the purposes of consumption credit, so that consumption credit will contribute to the development of double circulations. Thank you. Next question.
I have 2 questions. My first one is, will green finance relending be the new monetary policy tool to support the decarbonization policy? And my second question is, how does the PBOC prepare to handle external shocks? And will the impact of the Fed's policy, and also the impact of the Fed's policy tightening in the future? Thank you.
部新闻社记者，我一共有2个问题。第一个问题关于绿色金融，绿色金融方面的再贷款是否会成为将来中国低碳经济发展新的货币政策支持工具？第二个问题是央行打算如何应对美联储加息预期带来的外部冲击？谢谢。
好的，这2个问题呢，由孙次长来回答。
Mr. Sun?
我先回答第一个问题，关于碳减排支持工具。
Your first question is about the support of decarbonization. To implement the green development policy and carbon neutrality policies, according to the government work report, PBOC is on the way of establishing some mechanisms to support carbon emission reduction. We will take targeted measures to support the development of certain technologies, and we will try to galvanize more social capital to support carbon emission reduction. And it will be one integral part of our structural financial instruments. We hope to offer low-cost finance to support the financial institutions to lean more towards the carbon emission reduction projects. The instrument's design will be market-based and international. We will be transparent and open and actionable and measurable. We will try to guarantee the effectiveness of the financial tools. For example, we will specifically support the key areas of clean energy, energy saving, environment protection, and emission reduction. Measurability means we will try to measure the carbon emission amount, and the emission reduction information will be disclosed and be subject to social supervision. And traceability means we will invite the third-party organization to check the integrity of the emission reduction results. So such emission reduction tool will have some tangible results. We will guide enterprises and financial institutions to be aware of the importance of green transition, and we will try to establish the awareness of the public in changing their lifestyle. We encourage financing to lean more towards the green sector, supporting carbon neutrality and carbon peaking. As to your second question about the change of the monetary policy of the Fed and its influence over us. It is noticeable that recently there has been some rhetoric about the tightening of monetary policy of Fed in the Chinese financial market. We have observed that the credit ratio in 10 years' time is about 3%. That's relatively lower than previously. And RMB interest rate fluctuates. The financial market is steady. So now our Chinese economy is recovering and picking up. I think the monetary policy change of the Fed will have a minimized influence over Chinese financial market. In the future, PBOC will continue to look inward in conducting our macro policy, and we will try to give out positive signs to trigger stable recovery of global economy. Next question.
谢主持人，海报新闻记者提问：能够反映房贷变化的中长期贷款上半年增量。
The mid and long-term credit increased by trillions in the first half of this year. That's the highest in recent years. But we have heard about the news of tightening in the real estate market. So are those two pieces of information contradictory? I'm happy to take that question. According to the latest data, by the end of June, the RMB credit balance was 50 trillion RMB yuan, a year-on-year increase of 9.5%. The growth ratio was reduced by 2.2 percentage points than last year, and that's 2.8 percentage points lower than the other sector's credit. The balance increased by 2.4 trillion RMB yuan, taking up about 18.9% of the total in the same period. In it, the real estate credit has a balance of 12 trillion, a year-on-year increase of 2.8%. The growth ratio was reduced by 3.3 percentage points compared to the previous year, taking up of 2.7% of the total increment of the credit. As to individual housing credit, the balance was 36 trillion RMB yuan, a year-on-year increase of 13%. The growth ratio was lower by 1.6% the previous year, 2.1 trillion RMB yuan more than early 2021, accounting for 16.7% of the total credit increment. That's the overall statistics. Thank you all for the sharing just now. Within a short period of time, we have been very effective in answering questions. We've answered 15 questions, and that's all for today's presser. Thank you.